To call the taming of an animal its improvement is in our ears almost a joke. Whoever knows what goes on in menageries is doubtful whether the beasts in them are improved. They are weakened, they are made less harmful, they become sickly beasts through the depressive emotion of fear, through pain, through injury, through hunger. It is no different with the tamed human being. Nietzsche, Twilight of the Idols. Awakening. 1. Stormfront. Oarem slid aside the papers, tired eyes watering and twitchy hands made sluggish by days without proper sleep. He'd read through the old Hatfield account 4 times that day alone. The maps his father had left him depicting distant Powell County were sprawled before him, and he'd been digging through everything he'd been able to drag off the internet about the area over the past few years like a fevered fanatic. Recent events had only inflamed the obsession. Still, despite all his delving, he remained uncertain, and that was not a feeling to which he was accustomed. Oarem stood and swayed, light-headed after so long bent over the cramped basement card table over which he'd labored. He shook it off, aided in the motion by the muted roll of distant thunder somewhere far away. Turning for the stairs, he weaved through cheap, leaning bookcases and piled boxes to climb from the dim cellar into the house above. The old stairs creaked in protest beneath him, aged and buckling, but he kept his feet near the edges, and the moldering structure held firm. When he pushed out into the light of the tottering house's decaying kitchen, his eyes reeled. Only the ambient light spilling through the far window lit the room, and yet even this was a shock to him after so many hours in the dark. Squinting, he shrugged on his tattered coat and wound through the front room, almost reaching the door before a voice halted him on the mat. Where to? It was an uncertain question, though less practiced ears than Oarem's would have taken the words to be hard as iron. He turned to face the ratty old sofa, where a broad, unusually tall younger man watched his going with the nervous trepidation of a cat wondering where its next meal will come from. The arch, Oarem answered, zipping up the coat and turning back for the door. The storm will be here soon. Keep an eye on the place, and call me if our Eastern Brotherhood radio in. Let anyone else who's asking know where I've gone, won't you? The big man nodded, holding aloft his phone as if to signal he'd registered. Thank you, Soraya. Don't hesitate to get some sleep if you can. You've earned that much. The name was still new to the younger man. Soraya had only been inducted a month prior, and he was still settling into his role, name included. Oarem could see every ounce of the initiate's exhaustion hanging heavy in his eyes. Though he knew Soraya didn't mean it, Oarem nodded his approval when the nervous initiate assured him he'd try. Shoving out of his dilapidated home onto pockmarked and desiccated Thomas Street, Oarem found the sun had risen in a cloudless sky. Perhaps, he thought, the last this city would ever see. It was hot as midday edged closer, and aging St. Louis seemed all but deserted, leaving him to wind down onto the uneven sidewalk and stalk off east down the road in silent isolation. Not that the silence on his stretch of Thomas Street was all too strange. Half the buildings had been abandoned for over a decade, and the few which weren't were occupied by ancient stragglers who seldom left the modest safety of their crumbling homes. It was the absence of horns, sirens, and distant voices that chilled him, for even the dogs of the city seemed hushed and tense, as if awaiting a blow they knew must soon fall. Usually, the silence would have been delightful to Oarem. He was prone to taking late-night strolls for just that reason. The teeming hordes which buzzed like locusts about the old city didn't chafe quite as much after dark, when they returned to their hives to rest up for the next day's labor. Now, an hour before noon, the hum of the city had been replaced by the hush of an open-air tomb, and the only sound which occasionally pressed in on his racing thoughts was the thundering passage of military helicopters overhead, always eastward, towards a horizon Oarem could not yet see. He saw only one soul on Thomas Street, a shadow beneath a porch overhang which bustled out to watch him in wordless tension as he trotted past. Oarem did his best not to look, and was rewarded by the stranger's silence. No matter how disgusting he found the condition of modern man, no matter how decadent the urban sprawl in which he lived became, it never ceased to turn his stomach how soft the people amongst whom he lived had become. The storm approached, and rather than thunder forth to fight the unknown in the open, or revel and struggle and riot in the agitated anger of uncertainty, the people of St. Louis hid and hoped. They clung to their fleeting electricity and clean water while it lasted, and locked doors as if wood and iron could stop what was now swooping down upon them. Oarem imagined the silent observer was scouring his brain for answers. What kind of madman would walk the street at a time like this? Doesn't he know it's dangerous out there? My television told me to hide indoors, the last time it worked, anyway. Hasn't he heard? Doesn't he know he might be hurt? To the aimless wretches humankind had become, comfort and plenty were the sweetest fruits of life. The attainment and protection of these fruits was life's purpose, and the notion that someone would gladly seek hardship, would willingly throw themselves into the jaws of extreme experiences purely for the sake of overcoming the ensuing struggle, was as alien to the people of St. Louis as the clouds they knew must be sliding west towards their city. Even the dregs and outcasts of society, Oarem included, had been privy to placid comforts and small joys that no earlier century could have provided them. To act, to struggle, would be to break the seductive spell of security and pleasure they'd known all their lives. Far better to hide, they thought, to draw into their modest urbane fortresses and hope the dwindling military could finally do something to stop whatever was happening out there. So it must have been for all the cities on the continent already behind the wall of the storm, Oarem told himself. So it would be for all the wider world if someone didn't do something. As he rounded the bend onto Martin Luther King Drive, he grappled for the 100th time with the fact that he might well be the man required to do that something. After an arduous life of striving, straining, and succeeding, he might well be the only person left in the new world who knew how it could be stopped. All he could do now was wait, just as the frightened husks hiding indoors were doing, and anticipate contact from the Eastern Brotherhood. Much as he hated the waiting and the wondering, he found some solace, small as it was, in the fact that he would not spend his time cowering. He would read, plan, plot, prepare. Again and again, Oarem mulled over the words of the Hatfield account in his keen mind, projected the topography of distant Powell County, and recalled the many warnings handed down by his father about the coming storm. All his life, all his trials, had been preparation for this moment. Every long, terrifying yarn he'd heard as a child, every harrowing test through which he'd been put by the organization, every friend and fellow caller he'd lost along the way. Each hardship a new thread of scar tissue meant to strengthen his hide and shore up his courage for the cataclysm to come. Oarem didn't mean to let any piece of it go to waste. He passed the police station, shuttered and encircled with sandbags after the fleeting riots which had rocked the city weeks prior. The chaos had been quick. The masses, as was ever the case in the post-industrial world, burned and maimed only so long as their phones and feeds couldn't keep them fat and happy. The soothing opium of state-provided food rations and resurrected phone service had tamed them, and now, the few police left within this outpost of law and order were packing to flee farther west, as had any with the money and pull to purchase egregious gasoline at $20 a gallon. A woman scolded a child from an apartment balcony overhead, pulling him back into lackluster safety behind sliding glass doors. A man fixed a layer of sheet metal over the boarded front windows of his pizza joint on the cusp of the city center, as if this might preserve his livelihood from what was to come. A family who couldn't afford the soaring prices at the few operational markets left in town scuttled away from a military checkpoint with government rations in hand, as if what they expected was a tornado or petty civil unrest. Oarem supposed he couldn't blame them. Whatever figureheads clung to the fast-falling rungs of power in the country had aggressively controlled the narrative of what exactly awaited behind the wall of the storm. The favored old horse's misinformation and conspiracy had been trotted out by the established media to quell the wildest of the claims, and even then, the regions beneath the clouds lost contact faster than reports could spread. Those wildest claims were modest by comparison to what Oarem's studies told him was coming, and the only ones aside from him who seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation were the scattered soldiers stationed in town. There were only a few army personnel on the streets, growing only to a couple on every other street corner once he neared the riverfront. Oarem wasn't questioned or jostled, despite being the sole wanderer on the streets, regardless of how disheveled and restless he must look. His progress went uninterrupted, and the uniformed reservists, for that is what he fast realized they were, murmured and muttered in muddy tones amongst themselves, ever eyeing the east. They were children to Oarem, either lanky or fat or shaky on their feet, far too wide-eyed, timid, and youthful to have seen bloodshed or heard shots fired in anger. They were the breed of pale-faced soldier which enlisted solely to reap the rewards of the GI Bill. The real fighters were likely long gone, dead in the eastern hills and in whatever ruins of New York or Washington still stood behind the wall of the storm. Any who remained would be out on the brink, the few modern souls with the will to struggle in the face of their impending demise. The fact that whatever survivors fought on out there struggled in vain didn't dull the small measure of respect Oarem extended them. Indeed, he'd rather be out there fighting a hopeless struggle with violence rather than pondering the skulking, slinking struggle of subversion and stealth which he was ever more certain awaited him. The convention centers, shopping outlets, and expensive hotels downtown yawned dark and empty, and the deserted streets were only occasionally host to the rumbling engine of an armored personnel carrier or police cruiser. The emptiness again dragged Oarem to the point of near thankfulness. Not for the first time, he marveled at how, if this death blow to the all-corrupting urban sprawl had merely been brought about by his order, he might now be celebrating its coming, reveling at the screeching halt to which the decadent entropy of cosmopolitan excess had been brought. And yet, on he walked, unable to truly enjoy the quiet. As ever, the relief of silence in which to think was counterbalanced by disappointment. The people of St. Louis, from the highest roller to the lowliest beggar, had been stripped of their duties by the unknowable death knell which tightened like rope about them. Their security had been forcibly stripped from them, and uncertainty was their only certainty. A few had fired shots on the military food distribution checkpoints when rationing had been harsh, or raided dying supermarkets when scarcity was dire, yes. But few was the operative word there. The rest huddled and moaned and hoped. He was crossing to the arch now. It stood in the midst of a pathetic little outcrop of manicured greenery at the muddy river's bank. Gateway Arch National Park, it was called. A comedy even he was not cynical enough to enjoy. A monument to the conquest of a continent built to stand amidst a teeming horde of disconnected, rootless urbanites who didn't remember the first thing about conquest. As Oarem came into the thing's shadow, and the roiling darkness upon the eastern horizon across the Mississippi came into view, he figured they'd learn soon enough. if the coming storm wasn't the face of the enemy, if it was any other army or disaster or disruption, Oarem would have cheered it on. Winding along the little paths through the mowed park lawn to the riverside, Oarem leaned low over the rail and finally allowed himself a view of the horizon. It was dark out there, darker even than images he'd seen of rolling hurricanes approaching southern coasts, or tornado weather upon the flatlands west of Missouri. Normal storm clouds were shades of darkened gray. Shadowed as they might be by the fierceness of the threat they posed, they were never truly black. This continent-wide westward cloud wall was black, and it brooded so darkly as to seem like a hole in the sky torn straight through to the void beyond. Its lightless depths rumbled with low and distant thunder, but that thunder felt too low, a grumbling protest which shook the ground almost imperceptibly and raised the hairs on Oarem's arms. The lightning, barely visible in the gloom of the front, was almost illusory, flashing into strangled life for but a second before all traces of its gleam were lost to the abyss within the clouds. The ominous cloud bank overhead bulged and shifted awkwardly in the sky. Oarem imagined such motion had been constant, but with the storm closing in upon a cowering urban center, the things it held at bay had become restless and eager, and their thrashing had become impossible to ignore. Great tendrils of gray vapor trailed up from the bulk of the storm front to grasp at the open sky, before wriggling shapeless back into the depths. Like the many limbs of a searching squid, those half-solid appendages seemed almost to drag the clouds along as the rain ate up the last few miles between the unknown and the city. Even though Oarem knew this was not the case, even though he knew it was the storm itself that held the enemy's creations at bay, he couldn't deny that the scene looked hopelessly apocalyptic. None who looked upon it could possibly deny there was something wrong within that storm. There were no birds overhead. None troubled the banks of the river, and none scanned the rolling land out east for perches or meals. The stray dogs and cats of the city had been absent for days, and Oarem assumed the birds had gone much the same way, fleeing west before the arrival of certain doom, as had so many of the skittish men and women of St. Louis, all eager to cling to life for another day, another week, another month. At least the animals were aware of hardship, Oarem thought, for the human chattel of the cities which fled with them knew nothing of the privation and desperation which would find them in their flight across the continent. Whether man or beast, though, they'd all run out of land soon. When the inevitable march heralded by that continent-wide storm pinned them against the west coast, and they reeled at the thought of fleeing into the sea, then what? They were only a scattered handful at the riverside with him, watching the storm approach, and yet each seemed to have come alone. After the initial fright of newcomers seeing the animate, malevolent force which approached them, the scene was shockingly calm. None spoke among themselves, as far as Oarem could see, and no single soul sought the reassurance of words with another. He knew none of them, but he supposed they might be similar spirits. Even if they could not know the details of what the storm held back behind its veil of rain and fog, they knew in broad terms what it meant. They had walked in morbid fascination out to the riverfront to watch the coming of the end. Small a thing as it was, there was something admirable in that, the willingness to look death in the eye, and yet there were still so very few of them. Oarem had a moment to lament that he was in St. Louis as he waited for the clouds to roll in. This mighty old continent, so paradoxically termed the New World, was on its last leg, doomed to be altered beyond recognition by the forces skulking behind those tenebrous throngs of thunderous clouds. And yet, here he was, stuck in the city in which he'd been raised, blind to the savage beauty that was about to be blotted out beneath that rain. The jagged spine of the Rockies, the oceanic expanses of the open plain, the canyon lands of the sun-scorched southwest, all of it was on the chopping block. Never again would those harsh, stunning landscapes be what they were meant to be. Never again would they be free from the influence of the dreamer, which sought to mold them in its image. All Oarem could expect to see of the uncorrupted land in the path of the vast storm was the manicured lawn beneath the gateway arch, and the shrubs and sad trees clinging to wretched life in planters and wilting yards across this gilded concrete cage of ease and plenty in which he dwelt. This city had once been a source of strength to him. His stranding in the thrum of urban decadence and weakness had been the pool from which his order drew disaffected recruits. Bored by the merchant's maze of jobs and rent and gaudy delights, it was here, among the easy aimlessness of modernity, that the souls most prone to throw aside their boundaries and embrace hedonistic extremism were to be found, ready to risk everything just to feel alive again amidst their slavery to the clock, the rent, and the law. The effect had been much the same upon Oarem, for every trial or tribulation put forth by his work for the organization had been exhilarating and challenging by comparison to the humdrum monotonous comfort of the gateway city and its decaying inhabitants. He had often felt like some ancient conqueror or awakened sorcerer passing among the ranks of zombies and golems which walked, but never thought or acted, and this had kept him warm in the coldest and cruelest conditions. Now, with the jaws of the enemy seeming to snap shut in slow motion all across the new world, it felt like the weight of the sleeping masses which cowered behind him was a bind upon his limbs, against which every struggle might well be pointless. It was a human fear, he realized, to balk when faced by the annihilation promised by the otherworldly things which skulked and grasped behind masking clouds. That didn't make it any easier to shrug off the despondence that swept low over him as the distant fields and suburbs surrounding St. Louis fell beneath the shawl of the dreamer, and were lost to the natural world outside the storm. Rather, the humanity of his hopelessness made it more difficult to deny. Perhaps the dreamer was right about humankind, Oarem thought. Perhaps they were always weak, civilized or not. Perhaps they had never been strong. Perhaps all the feckless complacency Oarem pinned on post-industrial modernity had always ruled human consciousness. Perhaps the plentiful, placid security of modernity merely made it more noticeable. These thoughts and more he shook from his head as he watched the darkening sky and listened to the rumbling approach of the enemy. Perhaps, he corrected himself, these thoughts were poison breathed into his mind by the enemy beyond the horizon. The dreamer was, after all, quite adept at bending the minds of a sensitive and powerful few to his will. Oarem had struggled too far in this world to lay down and die now, with the trial of his life before him. Not half an hour had passed in contemplation before Oarem's phone vibrated against his leg. He turned from the rail and made for home the way he had come, the day growing darker overhead and the streets ever more silent as time ticked out. The sun, in its slow journey westward across the sky, seemed almost to be fleeing from the advance of the storm, a fitting picture of what was to come, he thought. Oarem didn't need to check his messages. He didn't need to question. He knew why it was he'd been called. He felt certain he knew exactly what the Eastern Brotherhood was calling to report, and it would not be victory. The clouds and the slow march of the enemy's progress told him as much. All he could do now was brood and shore himself up for the trials to come.